Race is a powerful social construct in our modern world. Note that I refer to it as a social construct and not a set of biological categories. This is an extremely important distinction. When we grow up in a certain system with a certain set of ideas, it is easy and even typical for us to consider those ideas as natural, unquestionable, immutable. However, failing to see the distinction between socioculturally constructed ideas and objective biological reality is a dangerous fallacy. We can see this play out in many of the hallmark topics of inquiry in anthropology. For example, we see it play out in the distinction between biological sex and cultural ideas about gender, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. We also see it in the fundamental questions about whether certain commonly observed human behaviors, such as a propensity for violence, are part of our genetic evolutionary heritage or part of our learned sociocultural heritage. These kinds of debates are sometimes referred to as nature versus nurture. Let's talk about all of this in the context of race, the topic of our current chapter. I'm not going to tell you that race isn't real because it actually is. However, it is a sociocultural reality and not a biological one. What I mean by this is that when geneticists and biological anthropologists analyze the vast amount of genetic and evolutionary data on human biological variation, there is no evidence to support the division of our species into biologically meaningful subspecies or races. The biological evidence is simply not there. There is far more genetic variation within so-called racial categories than there is between them. In fact, all humans share 99.9% of our genetic makeup. Of the 0.1% that varies, 85% of that is accounted for within so-called racial groups, so only a tiny percentage of our genes code for traits traditionally used to distinguish races. In no other species of animal would biologists ever argue for the existence of biologically meaningful races or subspecies based on these numbers. There has simply been too much gene flow or interbreeding between human groups in the past and certainly in the present for this to be the case. However, when cultural anthropologists and other social scientists look at the sociocultural data, it is clear that the social categories that we commonly refer to as races have deep meaning and influence on our daily lives and on the overall quality of our lives. Sometimes people benefit from others' perceptions of their race, but oftentimes racial perceptions and stereotypes that go along with them are detrimental to the lives and livelihoods of oppressed or marginalized people. There is a good book, a little old perhaps, but really good nonetheless, that I highly recommend for anyone who might be interested in the history of the race concept. It is called The Emperor's New Clothes: Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium by Joseph Graves, Jr. In this work, Graves traces the historical development of the race concept, arguing that it is rooted in colonialist pursuits starting in the 1500s as an attempt to justify the subjugation of tribal peoples by Europeans for political and monetary gain. As a result, pseudoscientific and religious arguments were constructed to falsely suggest that these people, usually with dark skin, were not even really people. They were a different species and therefore could be treated as animals. Look up monogenism and polygenism for more information. Of course, we now know these ideas to be wrong and dangerous, but this was an actual question that people were asking just a couple hundred years ago. Graves does not deny that people before the 1500s categorized and ranked people, but when they did, it was not based on ideas of biological superiority, but rather cultural superiority. So the race concept is actually fairly new in the history of humanity, and racial thinking is something that is historically situated and context dependent. Some of these race scientists argue that there were only two human races. Others argue that there were 5, 10, 60, or hundreds. The racial scheme prominent in one region versus another region depends largely on the history of migration, forced or voluntary, into or out of that region. For example, in the United States, many institutions use the categories of white, European, Black, African, Asian, Southeast Asian, and Indian, Native American, to categorize people. This just so happens to be a reflection of the history of non random migration to a land that we now call the United States. Lots of people coming in from Europe, Southeast Asia, and Africa into a land that was already occupied by Native Americans. The more migrants we get from more places in the world, the more we are forced to expand and tweak these categories, and the more it becomes clear that the system is inherently imperfect because the boundaries between the groups are not scientifically meaningful, let alone clear. The forum question for this week asks you to consider biological fallacy versus social constructs. While biological races do not exist, shared ideas about race have a real and genuine effect on our lives and interactions. The film this week is a series of short clips produced by PBS and provided by the New York Times. It takes a rather interesting perspective on race, specifically a material cultural perspective. Material culture refers to the tangible stuff we make and use in our everyday lives, and this stuff is a big part of shaping and broadcasting who we are and what we think about the world. The video looks at racist objects and how people think about them, debate them, and use them today. Remember to read the chapter carefully, and like always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.